It didn't start with a bruise. It didn't start with a scream. It started with something so subtle you almost missed it. A sigh. A pause. A quiet correction in your tone. The first time he looked at you like your voice was inconvenient. That was the beginning. And no one saw it. Not even you. Because when there's no blood, no breaking glass, no shouting match echoing through the walls, it's easy to pretend it's not happening. You tell yourself you're being dramatic, sensitive, maybe even ungrateful. After all, he hasn't laid a finger on you. So why do you flinch when he walks into the room? Why do you rehearse your sentences before you speak? Why do you wake up in the middle of the night, crying and not knowing why? This is the violence no one talks about. The psychological kind. The emotional erosion. The manipulation that wears a calm face and speaks with a soft voice. It's the kind that sits across from you at dinner and smiles while dissecting your confidence. The kind that never raises a hand, but still finds a way to hold your soul hostage. And here's the cruelest part. The world doesn't believe you. Not your friends. Not your family. Maybe not even yourself. Because you have no proof. Only the heaviness in your chest, the confusion in your mind, and the quiet terror that this isn't love. It's war disguised as romance. He didn't scream at you, he just looked disappointed. He didn't isolate you. He just made you feel guilty for needing anyone else. He didn't call you names. He just made you question whether your thoughts were ever valid to begin with. It's not the obvious abuse that wrecks you the most. It's the kind that's invisible. The kind that makes you doubt your own memory. The kind that makes you apologize for wounds he created. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything no matter how absurd to avoid facing their own soul." But what happens when the person avoiding themselves uses you as the mirror? What happens when their self-hatred is so buried, so repressed, that the only way they can feel powerful is by dismantling someone else's spirit? Quietly, strategically, patiently. They call it emotional neglect, gaslighting, covert abuse. But none of those terms capture what it feels like. What it feels like to be dismissed while being smiled at. What it feels like to be touched by someone whose hands carry control instead of comfort. What it feels like to lie next to a person who says they love you but whose presence makes you feel like you're disappearing. You wake up crying not because of a nightmare, but because you've been living inside one. A nightmare that no one else sees. A nightmare without monsters, just confusion, self-doubt, and silence. A silence that screams louder than any fight ever could. He's not evil in the way movies show. He doesn't slam doors or threaten to kill. He's more sophisticated than that. He weaponizes subtlety. He hurts you in ways that don't show. In ways that make you look like the unstable one. That's the genius of his manipulation. He doesn't need to be violent. He just needs you to doubt your own sanity. And slowly you start to believe him. You start to believe that you're the problem. You're too emotional, too reactive, too needy. And every time you feel the pain in your chest, every time you find yourself crying on the bathroom floor, you tell yourself you're overreacting, that it's not real, that it's your fault. But let me tell you something no one else will. It is real. The hurt that has no bruises is still hurt. The tears that fall without a trigger are still valid. The confusion you feel every time he's kind after being cruel is not love. It's psychological warfare. It's conditioning. It's abuse dressed as intimacy. They'll tell you you're lucky. They'll say, "At least he's not hitting you." But they don't see how your identity is unraveling. How your laughter has gone quiet. How your opinions have disappeared. How you tiptoe around the person who claims to love you. That's not love. That's control with a smile on its face. And here's the most dangerous part. He believes he's good. He believes he's the victim when you speak up. He believes that your pain is an attack on his character. He tells others you're unstable, emotional, dramatic. He plays the role of the calm one, the rational one, the saint who puts up with your moods. And the more he does it, the more you start to shrink. Until one day, you forget who you were before you met him. You don't recognize your own reflection. You don't remember what it feels like to speak without fear, to laugh without checking his face first, to exist without needing someone's permission. That's what psychological abuse does. It doesn't just hurt. It erases. It confuses. It rewrites the narrative until the villain becomes the hero, and the victim becomes silent. But here's the truth. If you wake up crying and you don't know why, something is wrong. If you find yourself constantly anxious, constantly second-guessing, constantly apologizing, it's not love. It's psychological captivity. And just because he didn't hit you doesn't mean he didn't hurt you. This is only the beginning. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't slam doors. He doesn't leave you bruised. Instead, he listens. At least, that's what it looks like. He nods. He maintains eye contact. He lets you speak. But deep down, something always feels off. Because when you finish talking, nothing changes. Your words dissolve into silence. Not the silence of reflection, but the silence of dismissal. You're not being heard. You're being tolerated. And there's a difference. A devastating one. That's how it begins. With attention that feels like presence, but is actually observation. With empathy that mimics concern, but hides an agenda. You mistake his curiosity for care. But he's not listening to understand. He's listening to disarm, to locate your soft spots, to learn your patterns, to identify where the doors are. So one day he can lock them. And he does it so gently, so patiently. He doesn't question your feelings. He questions your timing. Why are you bringing this up now? He'll ask, as if the moment matters more than the message. He doesn't reject your opinions. He just wonders if maybe you're seeing it too emotionally. He doesn't say you're wrong. He says he's just trying to understand. And in those subtle shifts, he repositions himself as the voice of reason, and you as the unreliable narrator of your own life. Carl Jung warned us, the most dangerous psychological state is the one in which a person believes they are always right. And when a man uses calmness as his shield, when he weaponizes composure to maintain moral high ground, he becomes almost impossible to expose, because no one believes the woman crying can be the one telling the truth. No one suspects the man with the soft voice and steady tone, especially when he says he just wants peace. But peace in his world means silence. You're silent, and every time you speak your truth, you disturb that silence, which means you become the problem. Not the behavior, not the neglect, not the manipulation, just you. And this is the moment the switch flips. Not visibly, not loudly, but permanently. The man who once praised your strength starts labeling it as aggression. The man who once said he admired your independence begins to call you too much. The man who once called you beautiful now jokes about how dramatic you've become. And it's always a joke, always just subtle enough that if you react, you look like the sensitive one. That's the trap. He doesn't attack you head on. He erodes you slowly, quietly, with a smile. He'll say things like, "I'm just trying to help you grow," as if your discomfort is a lesson, as if your tears are a reflection of your own failure to evolve. And because he frames it as support, you internalize the blame. You start to believe that maybe you are overreacting, that maybe he is the grounded one, that maybe you're just too sensitive for real love. But the truth is, love doesn't feel like confusion. It doesn't feel like walking on eggshells. It doesn't feel like being a student in someone else's emotional classroom, constantly trying to pass invisible tests. Real love doesn't shrink you to make space for someone else's ego. It doesn't demand that you fold yourself smaller just to be tolerated. He creates confusion on purpose, because confusion is the most effective form of control. If you're unsure, you won't act. If you're doubting yourself, you won't lead. If you're constantly trying to prove your emotional stability, you'll never question his emotional cruelty. And that's the point. Not to hurt you directly, but to make you hurt yourself in his name. He'll call you safe when you're silent, stable when you're compliant, loving when you're apologizing. But the moment you ask for reciprocity, the moment you dare to mirror his calmness with truth, the mask slips. Not completely, just enough. A sigh, a delayed response, a passive-aggressive comment laced in false concern. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe this is coming from somewhere else. Maybe you should talk to someone. But you are talking to someone. You're talking to him, and he's using your vulnerability as ammunition. Jung described this as shadow projection, when the unacknowledged parts of the self are cast onto others. He doesn't see his control as control. He sees it as order. He doesn't see his coldness as emotional distance. He sees it as strength. And anyone who challenges that narrative must be unstable, emotional, irrational. So you start to police yourself. You start editing your tone, your words, your emotions. You apologize before asking for anything. You suppress your intuition. Because it's been dismissed so many times, it no longer feels trustworthy. And eventually you stop bringing things up altogether. Not because the issues are gone, but because your hope is you wake up next to someone who thinks he's a good man. And in some ways, maybe he is. He doesn't cheat. He doesn't hit. He pays the bills. He says the right things. But at night, when the lights are off and your thoughts are loud, you feel more alone with him than you did when you were single. You cry quietly, not because of what he said, but because of what he's slowly stolen. Your voice, your clarity, your self-trust. And the world won't believe you. Because he's calm. He's polite. He's composed. But inside your body there's chaos. And that chaos is not weakness. It's not irrationality. It's your nervous system telling you the truth your mind has been trained to doubt. So hear this. Calmness is not the same as safety. Stillness is not the same as love. And the absence of violence is not the presence of kindness. What you're experiencing is real. He doesn't yell, he smiles. He doesn't demand. He offers. He doesn't forbid. He suggests. That's how it begins. With warmth, with attentiveness, with a level of care so consistent, so well-timed. It almost feels supernatural. You think you've finally been seen, understood, respected. He listens when you speak. He remembers your favorite drink. He texts first. He makes you feel like you matter. But slowly, something shifts. Not loudly, not suddenly. Just enough that you question your own memory of how it used to be. One day, you say no to something small. He pauses. His energy tightens. He says it's okay, but his tone says otherwise. You feel the shift, but you ignore it. He's done so much for you. Maybe you're being difficult. Maybe this is just your trauma talking. You apologize. And that apology becomes the first of many. Not because you were wrong, but because kindness has become currency. And you're afraid of what happens if you stop paying. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What you don't see yet is that this man, the one who seems so kind, is playing a deeper game. His kindness is not rooted in love. It is rooted in strategy. It is conditional, transactional, and worst of all, it is memorized. He doesn't give to give. He gives to bind, to control, to confuse. He does nice things too nice. He buys you things you didn't ask for. He surprises you often, excessively. And then when you express discomfort or pull away from something unrelated, he reminds you gently of all the things he's done for you. Not directly, of course. That would be too obvious. Instead, he'll say, "I just wanted to make you happy," or "I guess I cared too much." And suddenly, you become the one who hurt him. You feel guilty. And that guilt becomes the leash he walks you with. He doesn't raise his voice. He raises your sense of debt. He doesn't control through fear. He controls through obligation. And slowly, you learn to stay quiet, not because you're afraid of his anger, but because you're afraid of his disappointment. He won't punish you with violence. He'll punish you with withdrawal, with silence, with that subtle shift in tone that makes you feel like you're no longer, that you've broken something, that love has been revoked. And that's where the psychological abuse begins. Not in what he does, but in how he makes you feel responsible for how he feels. He gives excessively, so you'll question yourself before ever setting a boundary. He compliments you constantly, so you'll hesitate to call him out. He seems too nice to be capable of harm, so you must be the unstable one, the ungrateful one, the difficult one. You begin to doubt your instinct. You begin to filter your needs through the question, will this make him feel unappreciated? This is not kindness. This is manipulation wrapped in a velvet glove. This is emotional conditioning, and he's not even fully aware he's doing it. That's what makes it more dangerous. He believes he's a good man. He points to his actions, his gestures, his support, but none of it is free. Everything has a weight. Everything has an invisible price tag. And the moment you try to assert yourself, he hands you the bill. You say no to dinner one night. He says, "It's okay," but then reminds you of how he canceled plans last week just for you. You bring up a concern. He nods, listens, and the next morning, he's distant. Not cold, just less available, less present, and you start to panic. Not because he's punishing you overtly, but because the version of him you loved has retreated, and that withdrawal feels like abandonment. So you adjust, you shrink, you apologize, and the cycle resets. Carl Jung once wrote that what is repressed becomes projected. This man may not scream or hit, but deep within, he harbors unacknowledged needs for control, for validation, for superiority. And because those needs are unspoken, they leak into his version of love. He doesn't see you as a partner. He sees you as a mirror that must always reflect him as generous, kind, good. And when you don't, when you set boundaries, express anger, or ask for space, you shatter that mirror, and he punishes you for the break, but always kindly, always politely. He'll never call you name, but he'll say, "I just wish you could be happier," as if your pain is a flaw, as if your anger is the problem, as if your boundaries are a betrayal. And the people around you, they see a man who's doing his best, a man who treats you so well. And that's the trap, because you can't explain the wound when there's no visible weapon. You can't describe the prison when the walls are made of flowers. So you begin to suffer in silence. You don't just cry at night. You cry without knowing why. You feel lost, numb. You second-guess your memory. You defend him to your friends. You isolate, not because he asked, but because you're too exhausted to explain the confusion that even you don't understand anymore. But here's the truth. When kindness is used to create debt, it is not kindness. It is control. When compliments become a way to disarm you, to silence your intuition, to make you stay even when your soul wants to run, it is not love. It is a trap. A beautiful, polite, socially acceptable trap. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not imagining things. You're living with someone who has learned to manipulate through kindness. And the longer you stay, the more you'll feel like a bad person for wanting to leave. Because he's not that bad. Because it could be worse. But that's the point. Narcissistic control doesn't always come with screaming and chaos. Sometimes it comes with gifts, with flowers, with silence. At first, it's small. A moment of hesitation, a soft doubt, whispering, "Maybe I was too harsh." You brush it off. But it returns stronger, heavier, more convincing. After every conversation, after every disagreement, after every unmet need, and before you know it, the voice isn't just whispering. It's narrating your entire life. "I overreacted. I misunderstood. I made him feel that way." You start apologizing before you speak. You rehearse your sentences before you confront. You blame yourself for everything. But here's the terrifying truth, that blame is not yours. It was planted. It didn't come from nowhere. It was conditioned. Carefully, gradually, subtly. He didn't accuse you. He questioned you. He didn't insult you. He suggested better ways for you to say things. He didn't call you wrong. He just framed himself as the logical one. And every time you defended your feelings, he acted like you'd just set the house on fire. His disapproval wasn't loud. It was surgical, cold, strategic, like a doctor numbing you before the incision. And by the time you noticed the wound, it was already infected with shame. Carl Jung once said, "Shame is a soul-eating emotion, and what makes it lethal in relationships like this is how invisible it is." You're not being beaten. You're being rewritten. You're not being yelled at. You're being gaslit, slowly, emotionally, with precision, until the lines blur, until you can no longer separate his discomfort from your responsibility. And the moment that switch happens, the abuse becomes self-sustaining. He no longer needs to control you. You control yourself. You shrink before he even speaks. You apologize before he even reacts. You leave your own truth outside before you walk through the door. That is the damage. Not the fights, not the arguments, but the internalization of his reactions, as proof that you are the problem. He says nothing, but his sighs scream. He doesn't punish, but his silence crushes. He doesn't command, but you still adjust. Every single time. You wake up exhausted. Not from physical strain, but from emotional contortion. You bend in ways no one can see. You break in ways no one will believe. Because on the outside you're still functioning, still smiling, still lucky to be with someone so good. But inside you're unraveling, one self-doubt at a time, one silenced instinct after another. And here's the most sinister part. When you finally begin to collapse, he'll be the first to express concern. He'll say he's worried about you, that maybe you need help, that maybe this isn't about us. It's something deeper. And that final twist leaves you breathless. Because now your pain has become his evidence that you're unstable, that maybe he's the victim, that maybe you were too broken to love properly. And the world, your friends, your family will believe him, because you're the one falling apart, and he's still calm. But what they don't see is what you've survived. They don't see the micro expressions, the subtle withdrawal, the conditioned guilt, the careful way you speak to avoid being misunderstood, the anxiety that floods your chest before every conversation, the tears that fall silently in the bathroom after every miscommunication. They don't see how your sense of self has been shattered and rebuilt around his comfort. This is not your fault. Let me repeat that. This is not your fault. You didn't become reactive overnight. You didn't start crying for no reason. You didn't suddenly become irrational. You were slowly dismantled, emotionally rewired, taught to doubt your own perception of reality. Carl Jung called this the danger of over-identification with the persona, the mask you wear to be accepted, to survive. And in these relationships, the persona becomes not just a survival tool. It becomes a prison. You can't be messy, can't be loud, can't be human. You have to be palatable, predictable, peaceful. And when you fail to meet that standard, you punish yourself faster than he ever could. And he loves that. Because as long as you're busy questioning your own emotions, he doesn't have to take accountability. He doesn't have to change. He just has to keep being reasonable, keep being supportive, keep being confused by your reactions. He wears confusion like armor. I don't understand why you're upset. And because you've been trained to see him as the calm one, the healthy one, you turn the interrogation inward. You become your own prosecutor. But what if I told you, you're not broken, you're not unstable, you're not dramatic, you're wounded, you're carrying the weight of his projections, his insecurities, his avoidance, and you've been trained to believe they belong to you. That's the brilliance of emotional manipulation. It doesn't make you hate him, it makes you hate yourself. And the longer it lasts, the more it becomes your identity. You stop asking for help because you're ashamed of how confused you are. You stop explaining your pain because no one seems to understand it. You isolate, you spiral, and eventually you stop trusting any version of reality, including your own. But there's a reason your body keeps breaking down. There's a reason your chest feels heavy. Your throat tightens. Your tears come unannounced. Your nervous system knows. It remembers. It's trying to scream what your mind has been taught to ignore. This is not love. This is self-destruction in slow motion. You keep blaming yourself because you were trained to do so. But healing begins when you remember that self-blame is not the same as self-awareness. That taking responsibility doesn't mean accepting fault for someone else's manipulation. That crying at night isn't a weakness, it's a message. A whisper from your inner truth saying, please, stop performing for someone who's not even watching anymore. There's a moment you don't notice until it's too late. A moment when you stop asking what you want for dinner and start asking what he would prefer. A moment when you catch yourself changing your clothes, not because you want to, but because you don't want him to say that thing again. A moment when you hear his voice in your head, even when he's not there, editing your every move. That's when it begins. The collapse, not of the relationship, not of your mental health, but of you. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But what happens when that self, the authentic, vibrant, opinionated, intuitive self, gets buried under layers of compliance? What happens when love becomes a mirror that only reflects what he approves of? You lose yourself. Not all at once, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. You fade, one compromised truth at a time. You stop saying no. You stop bringing up concerns. You stop laughing the way you used to. You stop existing for yourself. Instead, you become manageable, predictable, calm, quiet. You become the woman he prefers, the version that doesn't question, that doesn't resist, that doesn't threaten his illusion of control. And the more you perform, the more disconnected you become from your own body, your own thoughts, your own truth. And what makes it worse, he notices the change, but he doesn't grieve it. He applauds it. He calls you more mature, more balanced, more stable. But he's not seeing growth. He's seeing submission. He's seeing his fantasy come to life. A partner who bends without protest. A woman who reshapes herself around his preference. A soul that stopped breathing to keep the peace. You didn't fall apart. You were dismantled. And every time you tried to return to yourself, to express desire, frustration, fear, he looked at you like you were the problem. You're different lately. I just want the old you back. But the old you never existed in his mind. He never saw her. He saw potential, a moldable shape, an unfinished version of the ideal partner he could fine-tune. So you shrink. Not because he asks, but because your nervous system has learned that shrinking brings calm, that silence avoids tension, that hiding your truth earns you a little more time in the illusion of harmony. Until one day, you look in the mirror, and you don't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes are tired. Her voice is faint. Her laughter is rare. Her needs have been erased. You wonder when it happened. When did you stop being you? The answer is simple. The moment love demanded performance over presence. Carl Jung often spoke of the false self, a mask constructed for approval. And in toxic dynamics, especially with emotionally manipulative partners, that mask becomes your entire identity. You become a curated version of who you were, a better version, he says. Less reactive, less emotional, less intense. But what he calls better is just less of your essence, less of your boundaries, less of your depth. And the cost of that is spiritual disintegration. You begin to forget what joy feels like. You stop trusting your instincts. You wonder if your reactions are too much. You scan every situation for danger, even when things are calm. Because the calm is never safe. It's conditional. It's earned through self-erasure. And that erasure becomes your survival mechanism. You stop dreaming. You stop creating. You stop reaching. Because every time you expressed a dream that didn't center him, he made you feel selfish. Every time you pursued something outside the relationship, he reminded you how distant you were becoming. Every time you asked for space, he made you feel like you were abandoning him. And so you made a choice, again and again, to stay small, to keep the peace, to be lovable. But what he loved was not you. It was the version of you that served his emotional agenda. And the tragedy, you began to love that version too, because it was safer, easier. It made things smoother until it didn't, until the ache became unbearable, until the tears came without warning, until the emptiness in your chest became louder than his voice. And you realized something horrifying. You don't know who you are anymore, not what you want, not what you believe, not what you feel. You've become a reflection of someone else's comfort. And that's the silent death that emotional abuse brings. Not death by violence, not death by betrayal, but death by disappearance. You vanish, bit by bit, until your existence is reduced to how well you can predict, prevent, and protect someone else's emotional needs. You stop living, you start performing, and in that performance, your identity fractures. But here's the truth Jung would want you to hear. You are not gone, you are buried, and anything buried can be unearthed. The real you, the bold, curious, intuitive, passionate woman, she still exists. She's just waiting for silence to become unbearable, waiting for the mask to crack, waiting for the day you say, I miss myself more than I fear losing him, because that day will come. It always does. The human soul cannot live in captivity forever. It breaks, it rebels, it screams, and when it does, you won't need permission, you won't need validation, you'll just need to listen to that faint, but furious voice inside that says, I want my life back. It doesn't happen in a grand explosion. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's quiet. Almost forgettable. A moment so subtle you almost miss it. You're sitting across from him at dinner. He's talking about work, about his plans, about something that doesn't include you. And suddenly, for the first time in what feels like years, you see him. Not the version you convinced yourself existed. The real him. The coldness behind the charm. The calculation behind the calm, the emptiness behind the words, and something inside you shifts. A whisper that says, this isn't love, this is survival dressed as connection. And once you hear that voice, you can't unhear it. The spell begins to crack. You start noticing how tired you are after every conversation, how you feel smaller in his presence, how every compliment comes with a thread attached. You replay old moments, ones you dismissed, and now they sting. That time he laughed at your dream. That time he called you crazy for crying. That time you apologized, and didn't even know what for. You start to see the pattern, not just his but yours. The way you explain away red flags. The way you absorb blame, like a sponge. The way you traded authenticity for peace. You thought love meant adjusting, compromising, softening your edges. But now you see you weren't adjusting. You were disappearing. And the truth starts to land. Not all at once, but like raindrops on skin. Gentle, cold, unavoidable. You begin to question the foundation of everything. Was he ever listening? Did he ever really see you? Or was he just feeding off your ability to validate him? The mask he wore wasn't just for the world. It was for you. And the worst part, you believed it. You believed that his approval meant you were finally lovable. That if you were just better, calmer, nicer, quieter, he would love you the way you craved to be loved. But no version of you was ever going to be enough. Because his love was never about you. It was about control. That realization doesn't come with relief. It comes with grief. Grief. For the years you lost. For the parts of yourself you silenced. For the dreams you set aside. You grieve the woman you used to be. The one who laughed freely, spoke boldly, felt deeply. And then you grieve the woman you became. The one who kept trying. Who kept waiting for him to see you. Who thought maybe, just maybe, this time he'd understand. But understanding was never the goal. Obedience was he didn't want connection. He wanted compliance. He wanted your energy, your softness, your presence, without ever having to be accountable for how he treated you. And now that you see it, the illusion shatters, the fantasy dissolves, and you're left with something terrifying. Clarity. Clarity that this was never mutual. Clarity that you were never safe. Clarity that the person you loved doesn't actually exist. And that's when the fear sets in. Because if he wasn't real, what does that say about your memory, your choices, your love? You question yourself, not because you're weak, but because you're awakening. Awakening is messy. It doesn't come with confidence. It comes with vertigo, with disorientation, with the painful realization that you weren't in love. You were in survival mode. But within that fear, something ancient starts to rise. A voice, faint, steady, relentless. It says, you're still here. You may be wounded, shaken, exhausted, but you're still here. And that means it's not too late. Not too late to reclaim your voice. Not too late to stop apologizing for your truth. Not too late to start choosing peace over performance. You don't need his approval. You don't need his permission. You don't need to explain your awakening to someone who built their comfort on your silence. You just need to remember who you were before he convinced you that your worth had to be earned. The spell is broken the moment you stop explaining yourself. The moment you stop trying to make him understand. The moment you realize his confusion is not your responsibility. You've spent so long trying to be heard, seen, valued. But now you see the truth. He heard you. He saw you. He just chose not to care. Because caring would have required him to change. And change was never on his agenda. Control was. So you let go. Not in anger. Not in bitterness. But in clarity. Because nothing you say will ever be enough for someone committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need a final conversation. You don't need him to admit anything. You just need to walk away from the version of yourself that believed you had to beg for basic respect. And as you walk, shaking, scared, unsure, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Yourself. Not the version he sculpted. Not the mask you wore. But the real you. And she's not loud. Not angry. Not perfect. She's just honest. And that honesty is your new power. It won't make the pain disappear, but it will anchor you in reality. And from that place you can begin again. Not as someone who needs to be loved, but as someone who finally remembers that she never needed to be broken to be accepted. You were always whole. Healing doesn't look like you imagined. It doesn't start with confidence. It starts with trembling hands, with short breaths, with mornings that feel heavier than nights. You expect to feel free, but what you feel first is lost. Because leaving the pain didn't immediately bring peace, it brought silence. And that silence, after so long being filled with tension and anxiety, feels unbearable. But that's the cost of truth. It doesn't come wrapped in relief. It comes wrapped in grief. You grieve the time you spent begging for crumbs of connection. You grieve the self-trust you abandoned to keep the relationship alive. You grieve the life you could have lived if you had walked away sooner. And most of all, you grieve the version of yourself that loved someone who never truly saw you. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and now you understand what he meant. Because awareness doesn't heal you, it breaks you first. It forces you to sit with the weight of everything you allowed, everything you endured, everything you excused. But that pain has a purpose. It's not punishment, it's instruction. It's your soul saying never again. So you start small. You let yourself cry without justifying it. You allow yourself to miss him without mistaking that longing as proof that he was good. You stop explaining your choices to people who never saw the abuse. You stop waiting for closure from someone who built his love on confusion. You start listening to the voice you silenced for so long, the one that said something isn't right. That voice is your compass now, and it never lied to you. You begin to remember how it felt to take up space without fear, to laugh without scanning the room, to speak without rehearsing. And at first it feels awkward, foreign, unnatural, because freedom isn't familiar when you've lived in emotional captivity. But every time you choose yourself, no matter how small, it gets easier, braver, louder. And that's how you heal. Not in a single act, but in 1,000 quiet rebellions against the version of you that learned to survive by disappearing. You heal when you stop apologizing for needing more. You heal when you forgive yourself for staying too long. You heal when you stop romanticizing the bare minimum. When you stop calling chaos passion. When you stop mistaking tension for intimacy. You will still have bad days, trigger moments where a scent or a phrase or a silence sends you spiraling. But the difference now is that you'll know what's happening. You'll catch it. You'll remind yourself, I'm not back there. I'm not who I was. I am safe now. And that safety, it won't come from another person. It will come from you, from the boundaries you set, from the clarity you refuse to trade, from the self-respect you no longer negotiate. You'll no longer fear being alone, because you've learned the deepest loneliness is found in the arms of someone who makes you feel invisible. So when the shame creeps in, when the memories flood back, remind yourself, you weren't weak, you were loyal, you weren't broken, you were hopeful, you weren't naive, you were loving. And none of that is a flaw, it's your strength. The fact that you cared so deeply even in the face of emotional starvation is proof that your heart survived, even when everything else was fading. And now you get to rebuild, from truth, from self-trust, from a place that doesn't require you to shrink to be accepted. You are not hard to love, you are just loving someone who made love conditional, who made your worth dependent on obedience, who made your emotions a burden. But that was then, this is now. Now you honor the voice inside that says no without guilt. You protect your peace like your life depends on it. Because it does. You don't explain your healing to anyone who didn't witness your breaking. You stop waiting for apologies from people who are committed to never understanding. And most importantly, you choose yourself every day, especially on the days it would be easier to go numb again. Carl Jung believed that healing was the integration of the shadow, the reclaiming of the parts of yourself you had to bury in order to survive. And now it's time to bring back your voice, your fire, your intuition, your light. Time to forgive the woman who didn't know better, and thank her, because she kept you alive. And now you'll take it from here. This is not the end, this is the beginning. The silence wasn't peace, it was control. And now that it's broken, you are finally free.